You're tuned into the hottest paranormal life show on YouTube, Into the Fringe, where we discuss lost civilizations, UFOs, cryptids, unsolved mysteries, megalithic structures, extraterrestrials, interdimensional portals, time skips, and more. Don't change that channel, because now you are leaving the mainstream and entering into the fringe. Greetings, followers. It is I, your host, Cardinal Sin, and we are back for a very special episode of Into the Fringe, and I will dive right in. Joshua Cutchin has appeared on a wide variety of paranormal programs discussing his work, including Coast to Coast AM, Mysterious Universe, Binnall of America, Expanded Perspectives, Radio Mysterioso, and The Gralian Report. He is the author of 4 books, 2015's A Trojan Feast, The Food and Drink Offerings of Aliens, Fairies, and Sasquatch, 2016's The Brimstone Deceit, and an in-depth examination of supernatural scents, otherworldly odors, and monstrous miasmas, 2018's Thieves in the Night, a brief history of supernatural child abductions, and 2020's Where the Footprints End, High Strangeness and the Bigfoot Phenomenon, Volumes 1 and 2, with Timothy Renner. Joshua is also a contributor to Robbie Graham's 2017 collection of ufological essays, UFOs Reframing the Debate, as well as David Weatherly's 2018 Sasquatch Woodknocks Volume 3. Excerpts of his work have appeared in Fortean Times and Edge Science. Welcome to Into the Fringe, Joshua Cutchin.
Happy to be here. Round 2.
So glad to have you back.
Yeah, I'm ready for round 2.
All right. So, for everybody that didn't see our show last week, we had co-author Timothy Renner along with you, and tonight you're kind of going it alone. So, I wanted to ask you, is this phenomenon a trickster-related one, or is there intelligence behind these encounters?
Well, I mean, that's a good thing we've got another 2 hours, right? Because that's a pretty big question. In my more introspective moments, I kind of wonder if there is an intelligence behind the phenomena. By which I mean that it's almost something just like wind or clouds or something like that. So maybe I would think that something like an egregore or a tulpa doesn't really have an intelligence behind it. But I tend towards thinking that these things do have an intelligence behind it. Whether or not that's us in some sort of way of projecting ourselves, or whether that is some other external objective intelligence that's up for debate. I do think that there are strong trickster hallmarks in the Bigfoot phenomenon. To say nothing of the way that it's constantly impossible to get hold of, or the sort of disappearing evidence that Timothy mentioned in our last conversation. Those are factors to consider, but also if you look at some indigenous lore, they're explicitly trickster figures. And they also seem to have a lot of the hallmarks that if you look at George P. Hansen, the Trickster and the Paranormal, they also have the hallmarks of the trickster archetype that you would associate with other phenomena like that are more tricksterish, explicitly like fairy folk and aliens. I'm getting a really bad echo of myself.
Mm-hmm.
I got my headphones in, so I don't know if...
How's that?
That's perfect. That's awesome. I don't know what that was, but we fixed it. No, you're good. I actually ended up muting myself halfway through muting the audio on the computer so I could focus.
Sorry.
No, you're good. I think that there are those underlying trickster elements. And one of the things that I find most interesting about that is that there is an aspect to these phenomena where hoaxing and fakery can draw in legitimate activity. And I'm thinking of things like the two examples that I always go to are, number one, crop circles, which a lot of them are artificial, right? They're man-made. But people will still report being given the schematics for the crop circle, like through a divine vision, or they'll be out in the crop circle and they'll have missing time while they're making it, or they'll see light phenomena while they're making the crop circles. So it's almost like this sort of in-between zone where these things are hoaxed and not hoaxed. The other thing is the Philip experiment. Did I talk about this last time? I'm not sure if I did.
I don't think so.
Okay, so the Philip experiment was in the 1970s, I believe. A bunch of Ontario parapsychologists decided to create a ghost, and they came up with this entire backstory for Philip Aylesford, who was actually a spy in the English Civil War, and they gave him an entire fictionalized story, right? And they started having some seances, and they got genuine, from all appearances, genuine spirit activity that actually answered correctly all their questions about Philip's backstory that they'd made up. So I think that indicates that whether that was themselves doing it or whether there was a spirit that would actually sort of took that information and decided to act like it was this fictional character, I don't know. But it does seem to suggest that fakery can draw on these phenomena. And you do find some examples of some dubious characters who seem to be able to draw in legitimate phenomena. I would say after the Patterson Gimlin film, the Paul Freeman footage is some of the best that is out there. Anybody can find it on YouTube. It's some pretty good stuff. But Freeman also had a habit of happening upon prints in like the damnedest places. He like would just like happen to stop somewhere and he'd find Bigfoot prints, to the extent that like some other researchers were very skeptical of the footprints. But according to Jeff Meldrum, there's some of the better Bigfoot footprints that are out there in terms of the way that they exhibit specific aspects of primate anatomy.
With dermal ridges and mid-tarsal break and everything.
Yeah. Those are the ones I always go to, are dermal ridges and mid-tarsal breaks. There are other things like the weight distribution too. Really, Meldrum's book, Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, is like whenever someone's interested in Bigfoot, like that's the book that I always press into their hands, because it is great, and it's that gateway drug to saying, okay, there's something to this. And then, maybe 8 books in, I might hand them where the footprint's in. But yeah, so that's definitely an aspect of trickster phenomena. It's almost, I talk a lot about the difference between imaginary and imaginal. And, by which I mean, me daydreaming is imaginary, but something like drama that invokes actual emotions is imaginal. And the best way that I can sort of conceptualize this is you look at like a lot of shamanic healings, right? And these are practices that are really rife with a lot of sleight of hand and deception, where they're acting like they're taking some sort of foreign body out of someone's, abdomen or something. And it's just like a piece of a chicken liver, and they have some blood, and they make it look like it's a
psychic healing.
Yeah, exactly the same thing. But the truth of the matter, at least is the way that I perceive it, and the way as sort of Hansen does as well, is Hansen calls it the sham of shamanism, and it's the idea where you almost have to deceive to facilitate that sort of transformation in the witness. It's almost as if people are expecting a physical result, and if you don't show them a physical result, they won't actually get the actual results. Something akin to like placebo, or something like that.
Right.
Which I think placebo has some real important implications for what consciousness is. When people say it's just placebo, it's like, no, that's like the most that's like the most amazing, fascinating thing in the world, that your mind can have that much power. And your mind having that sort of consciousness, or that your mind being your consciousness, I think also has strong spiritual implications as well, because if our consciousness is capable of things like the placebo effect, then who says that we're not really swimming in some sort of spiritual soup, as it were?
Right. So there seem to be areas that are Bigfoot worlds or locations where these creatures tend to habituate. Have you seen the huge X's made with living trees that mark their territory? And if so, what do you make of them?
So Tim would probably have a little bit different answer than I do on this,
Mm-hmm.
because you kind of get Bigfoot tree structure pareidolia if you look at it enough, right? Like everything
Mm-hmm.
starts to look like a tree structure, and it's a lot of wishful thinking involved. I think Tim's a little bit more forgiving of stick structures and stuff like that than I am. Having said that, it's kind of funny that you asked that. I just went to Fort Mountain, Georgia this past weekend. I had some family in, and it's an ancient monument that they don't know who built it. The Cherokee said it was the Moon-Eyed people, which sound very much like fairy folk analogs, but completely unrelated to that. On the mountain, which I looked later has had some Bigfoot reports, there was a collection of sticks that were just absolutely propped together. Like just it was very blatant. It was
Mm-hmm.
either some very convenient falls or it was some deliberate action by people to put them together. Either way, it looked quite suspect. So I actually have a video that I just put up. I don't usually do many videos, but I recorded my impressions of the site, and that's one of the things that I saw. So people can, type my name into YouTube, and my channel will come up, and they can take a look at it themselves. So yeah, I mean, I'm kind of there's so much room for chance in a lot of these stick structures that I tend to be pretty skeptical of them. Tim has a lot more time in the bush than I do, though. So when he sees something that he thinks is strange, he's like, "Well, I kind of tend to respect his opinion on that." Now, as far as what they are, they'd be piss poor shelters. I mean, they wouldn't really provide any sort of cover from the rain. They'd also be really bad hunting blinds. Like they don't seem to really offer any camouflage in that sense either. So the idea that Tim was playing with I can't remember if it's volume 1 or 2, but he was playing with the idea that perhaps they might signify something a little bit stranger, something along the lines of basically magical practice, that Bigfoot might be some sort of spirit presence, and it also might be a flesh and blood creature that is just really, really good at what we call magic. Because there are comparisons that you can make between some, magical structures and some of these Bigfoot stick structures. I know it's fiction, but you can think of the effigies from the Blair Witch Project that sort of are reminiscent of that. And it's the Blair Witch Project also mentions that the Blair Witch was covered in hair, which I always found really really interesting.
Hmm.
Again, Blair Witch is fiction, but it's interesting how these motifs sort of express themselves in our fiction as well. He found an interesting documentary. It's pretty short. I think it's like 20 minutes, maybe, or like 12 minutes. I think it's on YouTube or it's on Amazon. It's called the Vertex Correlation, and it's these researchers who are investigating stick structures in Florida, and they determined to their satisfaction that the stick structures actually represented an asterism, a pattern of stars. In this case, featuring Sirius, Betelgeuse, and Procyon, rather.
Mm-hmm.
Also called the Winter Triangle, I believe. It's worth looking at. As far as the implications of that and what they might be, like I don't know. I think that the easy assumption is to jump to Bigfoot being an alien or something, but you've also got to look at that through the context of the importance that stars have always had in magical and spiritual practice as well. It's an interesting, quick little watch. It's a low time commitment, so you can get in and get out really quick. The Vertex Correlation is what it's called.
Cool. We will look into that for certain. What is the occurrence of high strangeness in Bigfoot accounts? Ray, the one-time witness versus the repeat experiencer.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There was a time. I mean, you're an old UFO salt, so you probably remember this too. There was a time when it was like an insult to call someone a repeater. you're a UFO repeater. Like it was something that that tended to discredit you, right? And a lot of the thinking in ufology, especially, but I think just generally in the paranormal, has changed to the fact that now we really tend to believe repeaters more, like they're encounter prone personalities, and I think that does bear itself out. And you see a lot of the stories where people see a Bigfoot while hunting, or they see a Bigfoot crossing the road, and they're like, "Well, that's just a big monkey." And it's completely understandable, because I think I would probably make that same assumption too. But when you see
or a
people,
bear or whatever,
or a bear, but like even when they're like, I clearly saw it. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a suit. It was it looked at me. It was a big monkey. It ran across the road. I could see muscle moving. I could see all this stuff. They're the ones who tend to think that it's a flesh and blood creature. But when you get to people who are repeat experiences, or more commonly habituators, so these people who have these longitudinal experiences of these phenomena on their property, that's when all the high strangeness really does seem to come out. That's when you start to see these areas looking a lot more like window areas rather than nature preserves. You'll get. I keep on trying to remember what I said last time, because I've done a show since then.
That's okay.
But it's I have a dear friend, Mike Cleland, who talks about synchronicities in UFOs a lot, and he said
owls.
one time, and owls, yep, exactly.
The owls are not what they seem.
It's so prescient, isn't it?
Isn't it?
But Mike said that once you get after the conference and you get some drinks into the researchers at the bar, that's when they open up about the synchronicities in the UFO field, and the same kind of thing,
stuff,
and the weird stuff, yeah, and the same kind of thing does happen with the Bigfoot field, from what I can tell. And people have really come around on the presence of orbs and lights in the woods. But again, I think Tim might have mentioned on the last episode that we did, people see Bigfoot around their property regularly, and they'll also have poltergeist phenomena in their house. They'll also have sightings of ghosts in their house. Or in addition to something like the strange lights. So it takes on the character much more like you'd expect to see from like a Skinwalker Ranch or a haunted house or something like that. There's one really interesting person that Tim interviewed, who claimed to have had some stuff that seemed like there were Bigfoot in the house, which is just like Harry the Henderson stuff, right? But
right.
The way that he was explaining is that he would get glimpses, and like doorknobs would rattle in the middle of the night, and he found in one instance like one giant footprint in the carpet in the middle of the room, which is just a wild thing to expect. But if you're thinking about these things as non-physical, then maybe that's what we're dealing with here. Bigfoot in the house is not something, even in stories where Bigfoot's flesh and blood, you don't get a lot of Bigfoot in the house stories. So.
Nobody wants a Bigfoot in the house.
There's a country music song that's in there, right? There's got to be. Nobody wants a Bigfoot in the house.
There was a single that I owned when I was a kid. It had Convoy on one side, and the flip side was Bigfoot. Bigfoot's coming, gonna get you, gonna get you, something like that. But whatever the phenomenon is, it doesn't seem to want to be classified. Can you speak to that and the folkloric aspects, the faithful, UFOs, humanoids, etc.?
I mean, yeah. So I think a lot of what I've done in my work was really focusing on that sort of interdisciplinary approach, paranormal approach, and I wrestle with a lot, right? I mean, there are too many similarities to these things to really deny. By these things, I mean Bigfoot and fairies and ghosts and aliens and poltergeists and and folklore of all sorts. Yeah, but at the same time, I'm not sure if that means that it's all one big thing with a lot of different faces. That's what I tend to think it is. But it could also just be that there's a lot of overlap on these Venn diagrams, right? So I think a good example of how that categorization fails is, did we talk about horse braiding last time?
No.
Braiding, okay. So there is an interesting phenomena where people will claim to find the manes of their horses braided overnight. And the skeptical answer to this is that people are not brushing out their horses' manes when they put them up, right? They get tangled over the course of the day with the wind and with running around and whatnot. That may very well be the case. Or there may be some sort of in-between gray area. Because people in the U.S., it's a thing that I'd heard a lot, is that Bigfoot sneak into barns and braid horses' manes at night. I'm like, oh, what the heck? Like, that doesn't even...
That doesn't
why,
track.
right? Yeah, like, why? But, I did find a record of a Russian researcher who claimed to see an almasty actually, like, climb into a stable and do that. But... And there are other stories of Bigfoot being preoccupied with livestock. There are some stories, trigger warning, of Bigfoot raping livestock that you can find.
Really?
Yeah. Horses and cows specifically. There's a story in Lauren Coleman's Bigfoot. I think it's called "The True Story of Apes in America" or something is the subtitle. But there's a story about a Bigfoot grabbing a cow with a giant heart on. So there does seem to be sort of an obsession there, which you could sort of say, well, there's, an obsession with livestock in the UFO phenomena with cattle mutilation, and it goes back to fairy folk too. The fairy folk would maim and mutilate and misplace cattle as well. But I find interesting the specificity with people saying Bigfoot is coming into the barn to braid horses' manes. Because if you look at, the old world, particularly Northwestern Europe, you will find those same that same behavior, that same phenomena attributed to fairies or witches. And the idea was that the fairies would, obviously a saddle wouldn't fit a smaller fairy, so the fairies or the pixies would braid the horses' manes into kind of stirrups, and they'd ride the horses and they'd put them back in the barn, ride them hard and put them up wet, right? Which is not as dirty a phrase as it sounds. And the same thing with witches. They go roaming about with Diana or whatever, the goddess. So I think one of two things. So there are three options here, right? It's all misidentification, and there's a lady by the name of, I think her last name is it Shiel? I'm gonna look it up here. Yes, Lisa Shiel. Yeah, Lisa Shiel, who I think lives in Michigan now, I believe. But she claims to have seen some braids in her Bigfoot hair, braids in her horse's hair that are really interesting.
Her horses are braiding the Bigfoot hair,
right? Hard without the opposable thumbs.
Yeah.
But
to that, I would have to say, nay.
Some really intricate braiding that she says she claims to have seen. So we have one of three things going on here. Either there's nothing to it, or these are all the same phenomena doing it, or there are fairies and there are witches and there are Bigfoot that are braiding hairs or horses' manes or something in between, right? And since I'm not quite sold on the nothing to it, I think that even if there is a natural explanation, there might be some overlap between that and something supernatural. But in some sense, I don't care. It's like all this Travis Walton stuff that's coming out lately, where everybody's like saying that it's a hoax and whatnot. Like, again, I don't care whether that story is true or not. Mm-hmm. What I care about is the fact that it is an expression of an older myth, and that's what I find really fascinating, and that's what I find really compelling. Or when you can make these connections and draw these conclusions. I just found a story today of the wild hunt in Germany, where this guy has a story that's just like just like Travis Walton's experience. You know, he was in the forest, he heard a buzzing noise, and he disappeared, and his friends were accused of murdering him. And he, shows up a couple of weeks later, and his friends are absolved, and he was, it has all the hallmarks of the Travis Walton story, and I find that more interesting than oh well, Travis Walton is telling the truth, or Travis Walton is lying. It's the same thing with the Bigfoot hair, right? Like the idea of like, well, is it just the horse's manes getting tangled up, or are there actually entities braiding it? That's not the story to me. The headline for me is, wherever we go, we find a boogeyman to do this. And I think that's really interesting. And it implies rather that there's something at least halfway unexplained about it.
So how do the flesh and blood and the paranormal Bigfoot research approaches differ? And what seems to be the overlap? Like earlier you were talking about the Venn diagram.
Yeah, that's a good question. In terms of the research methodology, there are people, for example, let's talk about the flesh and blood camp, right? Because, if you're UFO hunting, that's sky watching with a purpose, or like, astronomy with a purpose, right? If you are ghost hunting, that's like history or urban exploring with a purpose. And if you're Bigfooting, that's like camping with a purpose, right? So you can't like really get bogged down in whether or not you're going to find these things, because you'll see something compelling probably 1 out of every 10 times. From what I hear, I don't do it a lot for that reason, right? So some nights it's just dead, but the flesh and blood research approach tends to, it's interesting because sometimes they employ methods that sort of allude to more paranormal approaches, but they don't really realize that they're doing it, right? So, I mean, perfect example, wood knocks. They think that there are Bigfoot who are out there knocking on trees, or knocking on with rocks, or they're knocking on trees with sticks. And look, there are strange knocks in the forest, like that happens, and the implication is that either there's someone else out there doing it with their hands knocking something, or Bigfoot's doing it. I get that. And knocks in the forest are really interesting. Wood knocks are very interesting. But what I think a lot of these people don't realize is that's a very common means of spirit contact. I mean, not only in seances with raps and stuff like that, but like, there are plenty of stories of people going to fairyland or summoning the fairies by knocking on something. There's a hilarious story, I think it's out of Wales, where there was a guy who had mud on the end of his walking stick, and he tapped it on a stop sign 3 times, and out pops this little fairy who's like, "Yeah, you called." If that story is to be believed, I don't know, but again, like, it's, you find the researchers who are interested in the flesh and blood thing kind of slipping into these more, dare I say, woo sort of methods, the paranormal methods. Whereas, what I find really refreshing about the paranormalists who approach Bigfoot is they seem to be open to anything. So they'll use the same methods that the flesh and blood people would. Some of the things that people do is they set out bait, they set out used feminine products because they're convinced that Bigfoot is interested in that. They'll play tapes of children laughing. They'll sometimes play their guitars by the campfire, which kind of alludes to fairy folklore too, right? They were really fond of interacting with and abducting musicians. So, but no, Bigfoot's a monkey that's interested in the guitar. That's what they say. But the paranormal researchers will do things like bring out a tape recorder and listen for EVPs afterwards, or I've a couple people that I know who have use like a ghost box or an ovolus to sort of
Frank's box.
Yep. To sort of hope to speak to something and get some sort of a response back while they're on the Bigfoot hunt. And I really do like getting all that peanut butter all up in my grape jelly. You know what I mean? Like, I like mixing all that stuff up and just seeing how weird it can get. So yeah, I think that's a pretty good summation of the different approaches. Again, you find people who are at habituation sites time after time after time. They either start embracing the strangeness, or um, they start
Getting scared.
manufacturing or they start manufacturing excuses, right? So
Oh, I see.
one example that I always use is the North American Wood Ape Conservancy, which is a very flesh and blood oriented group um, out of Texas, and that I've heard is specifically antagonistic to some people that we know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but there was an example of where they were having a Bigfoot investigation, Bigfoot hunt, and there was a sighting, and they were like, radioing back and forth, and this guy pokes his head into a clearing, and he sees, nothing there except for like these 3 logs that are on the ground. And he was like, okay, well, there's nothing there. And he says that the next day he went back and those 3 logs were gone. And his assumption was that the Bigfoot was laying prone on the ground and looked like a log. Now I get that. I get that because that's alluded to in some folklore about, here's a good example. You often hear that Bigfoot looks like he's wearing a ghillie suit, which if you've ever seen someone laying on the ground in a ghillie suit, it's pretty damn hard to see.
What's a ghillie suit?
You've seen them in movies and stuff. It's the suits where they have like little bits of like gauze or whatever that are camouflage colored, so it looks all shaggy. And if you lay down in it, it breaks up the human silhouette enough that you can't even see people. You'll see snipers. You'll see snipers in that stuff all the time.
So it's like a camouflage.
Yeah. And the the ghillie suit is named after the ghillie dhu, which was a Scottish fairy that used to live in the Highlands, right? And the Australians don't call their ghillie suits ghillie suits; they call them yowie suits after the Bigfoot. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there is something to like the idea that Bigfoot's really good at camouflage, but some of these stories that you hear, it's not like, it's not like Bigfoot is just obscuring his outline. It's like, no, Bigfoot stopped and turned into a stump. There are stories.
Right.
There's one story of a researcher who supposedly sees a Bigfoot. He's looking at it through his binoculars, and the Bigfoot is walking, and then it suddenly just freezes in place and crouches down. And he sees a hunter walk up beside it while he's looking through the binoculars. And the hunter sort of starts, and then he goes, "Oh, you can tell that he just brushes it off as an odd looking tree stump," which is interesting for a couple of reasons. It's interesting because yes, trees can turn into Bigfoot. It happens in photographs all the time. The blob squatch. But also interesting because, again, on that sort of mythical level, you've got so much of a correlation between Bigfoot as a forest spirit or something, which has a lot of ties to the Green Man as well. And the idea that this is something that can sort of emerge to and from the forest and blend in that sort of literal sense, almost like a dryad from fairy folklore. So I think that's interesting too. There's one story that I don't believe this story, right? But I love it nonetheless.
Do tell.
There's one story where a researcher or someone who was having someone who was seeing a Bigfoot in her property in Washington State. This is from Barton Nunnally's book, The Inhumanoids. And she calls it out as it's walking away from her. And the Bigfoot stops and lays down and turns into a log that she says she used as a coffee table for years. I don't know what to make of that story. It sounds goofy, but again, let's talk about the folklore parallels.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that would happen when the fairies would take children is they would replace them with a log cloaked in glamour to appear like a child. There's one story in fairy folklore where they're actually a man actually hears the fairies carving this wooden effigy of his wife, and that's the way that he sort of stops them from taking her, as he calls them out on it. So again, that's what I find interesting, are those expressions, rather than if a woman somewhere in Washington State is using a Bigfoot as a coffee table. But I mean, that would be a good explanation for why we can never find bodies, right? They just die and turn into logs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then coffee tables.
Your door could be a Bigfoot right now, and you wouldn't even know
it. That would be terrifying. So there are medieval tales of wild men from the 1700s and beyond, and reports in newspapers about Bigfoot. How do we justify the wild man archetype versus stories of terrifying 8-foot-tall creatures that are wearing clothing and so forth? I think you're muted.
I did mute because I always am very conscious of not making a noise with my eyes.
That's okay.
So let me know if I'm repeating something that Timothy said, but he and I sort of put this together over the course of writing the book. So you look at some of these phenomena. Let's look specifically at the UFO phenomena and the Bigfoot phenomena, right? And you have the UFO phenomena constantly recontextualizing itself, right? It stays like one step ahead of us. Did we talk about this?
No.
Okay. So the UFO phenomena is always like one step ahead of where our technology is. And that's why, we had steampunk airships around the turn of the century, and then we had Art Deco flying saucers. Then we had these, these deep state black triangles flying in the sky in the 80s. And now it's these... I can curse on the show, right?
Oh, fuck yeah.
Okay, now it's these fucking Tic Tacs, right? So it's always changing, right? The UFO design is always changing. It's always one step ahead. It's on a continuum of primitive to advanced, right? And if you look at the wild man archetype, it's the inverse. It's going from advanced to primitive. By which I mean, a lot of these European wild men started out as like completely articulate, magically operant, powerful sorcerers. A good example is Merlin. Merlin was, in some descriptions, a hairy wild, like a hair-covered, strong wild man of the woods who actually ended up, knew how to converse with trees and the birds and the bees and whatnot. And then, excuse me. And then you sort of started to see this figure as just like a sort of a feralized human. And then around the turn of our century, this is where a lot of Tim's research comes in with those historical Bigfoot articles. You see Bigfoot, or these wild men rather, just clinging on to the last vestiges of being civilized. So it'll be like, oh, it was a hairy person, but they were wearing trousers, or it was a hairy person, but they were carrying a musket, or it was a hairy person and they were carrying a garden hoe. And then, around the 50s on, big monkey, completely just big monkey. And so you have this continuum of UFOs from primitive to sophisticated, of wild men from sophisticated to primitive. And it seems like it somehow reflects our expectations of what these things should be. Timothy puts it that as we gained scientific knowledge, as we adopted the theory of evolution, it seems like we sort of, in some ways, tamed the wild man. We sort of reduced it to something animalistic as opposed to being an actual primal force of the forest. Beyond that, what I would say about the wild man archetype is it's incredibly powerful. I mean, that's what every King Kong movie is about. That's what every werewolf movie is about. The same sort of wild man impulse, the animal within us. I think it's one of the most powerful archetypes that there are. and it just constantly expressing itself and expresses itself in any man's daily life. Some women too. I'm not trying to exclude them. I'm just trying to not be offensive. But yeah, it's something that we all deal with. And if you look at some of these old wild man stories, all the things that are outliers to the flesh and blood Bigfoot community, the things that they can't explain, the things that they struggle to explain, the things that they struggle with, all these things have some sort of precedent in these wild man archetypes. I don't know if we talked a little bit about the sort of gibberish that they say, right? These Bigfoot, and you'll find some stories saying that, oh yeah, wild men, medieval accounts. So wild men are capable of speech, but it's always nonsensical and you can't understand what they're saying. Well, that's pretty much spot on. You'll find stories of like, the wild man, can shapeshift. The wild man can size shift. That was a very common thing. Same thing. You'll find stories of wild men who live at the bottom of ponds. You'll find stories of wild men who are pulled out of the ocean. And there is a very common association between Bigfoot and water. There was one example I found from Indiana. During a UFO flap, a woman says that a hairy hand grabbed her while she was swimming underwater in a river or creek or something. The flesh and blood community doesn't really know what to make of that. And I think that it's interesting to perceive it from that sort of angle. And to sort of, you can sort of spackle over the holes in the flesh and blood hypothesis with this wild man thing in a really interesting way. And, I tend to think that archetypes are the source code of the universe. I always find it interesting when people can like really get on board with the simulation hypothesis, which I have a lot of problems with, but we don't necessarily have to get into that. But people can get on board with the simulation hypothesis, but then you talk about an archetype, and I'm like, well, no, that's what it is. It's like the source code of the universe. It's like, it's one of the building blocks. And like, I don't know what to tell you, but like you embody and live about, 10 of them a day, and you don't even know it. You fall into these ruts and routines. Yeah.
So many tribes of Native Americans and First Nations peoples have said that Bigfoot are simply other tribes of Indians, that they should be left alone and definitely not hunted. How does your experience address that?
Whether or not Bigfoot are indigenous people,
or other tribes of Indians.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so sorry. I keep on thinking that I'm repeating myself, but I would find it really interesting. People talk about the there being an endangered species that the logging company doesn't want anybody to know about. Did we talk about this?
Nope.
Okay. People talk about there being some endangered species that logging companies don't want to acknowledge because it'll mean that they can't come in and harvest the land for timber or any number of things. They don't want to get the EPA involved, so they keep it hush hush. This, that, the other. And some people have talked about that being a possibility for why, for the Bigfoot cover up, right? I don't think there's a ghost cover up, and I don't think there's a Bigfoot cover up. A UFO cover up I can get behind, but I don't think there's a Bigfoot cover up. I mean, yes, I've heard the stories, folks. I'm just saying that I think the government has bigger fish to fry. But what I love is, this is my own sort of headcanon that I play with when I'm feeling playful. I kind of love the idea, or I don't love the idea because it's kind of a gross idea, but I kind of find it fascinating and completely in line with the way that the United States government has treated Native Americans. If it's just another tribe that they don't want to have to acknowledge that they've been really mistreating for since for the 20th century,
years.
I mean, it's bad enough that we the whole reservation system, but these are people that we aren't even giving a reservation, right?
Right.
And they're hairy, and we're covering up whenever they're shot, and I think that's an interesting idea. That I mean, I don't think that's what's going on, but I always find that to be an interesting idea, and again, completely consistent with the way that we've treated Native Americans in this country. The government's like, well, we're too far in now. We haven't acknowledged them by now. It'd be hell to pay if we do now. So I don't know. You do find some people who describe sort of Native American features on Bigfoot, but it's not consistent. I mean, that's the other thing that sort of gives me pause is that people talk about Bigfoot as this monolithic thing, but like the descriptions they're only consistent to a degree.
Mm-hmm.
Big and tall and hairy, and some of the behavior, but some stuff's really unique. And sometimes you'll have, the most tangible difference is sometimes you'll have people describe a hooded nose, and sometimes you'll have people describe, a non-hooded nose, like a human nose versus a gorilla nose.
We have a pretty intermediate audience, but for those of us that don't know, what is a hooded nose?
So a hooded nose, like a human nose, versus a flat nose, like a chimp nose or something,
like a great ape.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you'll have those, inconsistencies, to say nothing of, footprints of different numbered toes, which we can get into at some point if you'd like. But
we will.
But yeah. But like all sorts of different sizes, we're talking about stories about Bigfoot that if you throw the Littlefoot stuff in there too, we're talking about like 2 feet to 14 feet in some instances, and it's just like, I can't believe that we're dealing with not only, it's difficult enough for me to swallow the idea of a large undiscovered primate. It's a little bit even harder for me to swallow the pill that we're dealing with like 5 subspecies, which is kind of what you would have to get that level of morphological diversity, I think. So yeah, I think that to me points to the idea that they're somehow drawing upon our expectations, and that this really is something a lot more metaphysical than physical that we're dealing with.
The phenomenon seems to go from playful to turning more aggressive and or violent and back again. How does the interaction between researchers and Bigfoot change over time, and what is the catalyst?
That's an interesting question, because it's kind of a primate thing. It's kind of a great ape thing, right? Like the idea that it can switch on a dime. I think about that one. Have you seen that woman who got attacked by the chimp and she like literally doesn't have a face anymore? Like
I heard about it though.
It's pretty harrowing. Like eyes gone, nose gone, lips gone.
Oh,
like,
wow.
Her face is just like a massive skin, and she's got a mouth, some nose, some nostrils.
And she's saying, but there's only 0.5% difference of DNA between us.
Yeah, wow. Right. Well, the worst part is it wasn't even her chimp. It was like her best friend's chimp. So, yeah, I know, right? So if you know
my
somebody
best friend's chimp.
So if you have a best friend who has a chimp, just don't hang out with them. But yeah, that sort of capricious nature. But that's you could say the same thing. Like, yeah, it's a great ape trait, but it's kind of also it's a very capricious sort of fairy trait as well. Now, as far as the way that expresses itself amongst researchers, Tim was talking about the story of the researcher, or the person who was sort of habituating Bigfoot, who kept on leaving out food. And, in one case, there was a gentleman who had to go off to Kuwait. This is in the 90s, obviously. And he had left his father-in-law or grandfather, I can't remember which, like the instructions to take care of the Bigfoot that he was habituating on the property. And the grandfather had a heart attack. So he gets back from Kuwait and like all the livestock are killed. If we're to believe that story, I don't know.
Whoops.
But super consistent. And Tim talked last time about the person who was leaving a cooler full of food for Bigfoot and didn't one time, and that's when they followed him home and got mad. All completely consistent with magical practice. Like you're not supposed to just suddenly stop leaving offerings to a spirit. That's a big no-no. So it's interesting how to see that sort of a change from this interest in this playfulness. But there are stories that I've heard too. Don't ask me for details because I can't recall any details right now, but I have heard stories
Josh,
too.
I want details. No, I'm kidding.
I just said of people sort of bringing their own energy to the camp, and I know that sounds real, kind of out there and woo, but there does seem to be that certain people tend to attract certain things, and that does extend into the Bigfoot realm for sure with researchers.
Yeah. Dave Paulides began as a Bigfoot researcher before he started writing the Missing 411 books. Do you think the two are related?
I think they're as related as anyone wants them to be. By which I mean, like I've said before, the Missing 411 stuff is a paranormal Rorschach test, right? So if you're really into Bigfoot, it's Bigfoot taking people. And if you're really into UFOs, it's UFOs taking people. And if you're really into fairies, it's fairies taking people. So with the entire self-awareness that I just said that it's a paranormal Rorschach test, it's fairies taking people, right? Because I'm really into fairies.
Right. Because it's been that way for thousands of years.
Yeah, but I mean, there are stories. Bigfoot abduct people. This is a very common motif in all the practically every Native American tribe that has some sort of Bigfoot figure will discuss this. Oftentimes women and children for consumption or
Breeding.
or consummation.
Right.
There are also stories like the case of the boy's last name, Martin, in Tennessee, where he was missing for several days. They sent in Green Berets, which seemed odd to the parents at the time. And there was, at one point, there was a witness in the vicinity who saw what looked like a bear running on 2 feet away from them with like a child slung over its shoulder or something to that effect. And the Bigfoot hypothesis, if that's what we're going to call it, for Missing 411 is really suitable and really compelling until you start getting into the incidents of inclement weather. I mean, yeah, so maybe Bigfoot times its abductions to just before a storm's going to hit. That's not unheard of conceptually. Like, certain animals are aware of things like that.
There's also the fact that, having just asked the question, do you think they're related, that no one's ever seen, a Bigfoot while they're on the trail, whether they're second last in line or second first in line. Whenever someone goes missing, there doesn't seem to be a correlation.
Well, and
yet...
and the people who could tell us what's going on are never going to tell us what's going on, right? So, you have this kid, Casey, I can't remember his last name, but he was in eastern North Carolina in the winter of early 2019, like January, I think. And he was in temperatures for several days where he should have frozen to death. He should have had hypothermia. Because I don't know if people know this, but like hypothermia, you can get hypothermia in like, I think 50-degree water. Like it doesn't take much to lower your body temperature just a few degrees. But the boy said that a bear took care of him. And, no.
That's pretty common. Yeah.
I mean, but like it's a common idea, but like it's no. Bear says we know them don't do that. So people are jumping to Bigfoot. I'm kind of stuck on like this expression of the Mowgli idea. That's like Mowgli tulpa, raised by bears. But so the Bigfoot thing regarding 411, to get back to that, the weather is a bit of a hang up. There are some things, like I believe some anomalous music in some accounts, like music just coming out of nowhere. It doesn't seem to fit. I would be remiss if I didn't say that all the things that you read about in those missing 411 accounts line up directly with fairy folk stuff. I mean, you've got fairies traveling on storms. There's your inclement weather. You've got the assumption that Paulides, or the observation that Paulides drew of people disappearing in the presence of berry bushes. It was a very big no-no to pick berries in some parts of the country. Still to this day in Newfoundland, right, where they imported a lot of that Irish folklore. Boulder fields, as people disappeared in boulder fields. Boulder fields are fairy homes in just about every culture that has fairies. You've got people wearing certain bright clothing disappearing. Another thing that the fairies didn't like to see.
And yet, aren't they reported wearing yellow jerkins and bright clothing?
Well, yeah. So that's a good point. Like, if you read, if you read 5 different descriptions of what colors fairies like or don't like, you'll get like 5 contradictory reports, right? So, like, you have the red caps, right, who have like little malicious dwarves who wear red caps because they feel
like the garden gnome.
Yeah, and then you'll also have another source say, "Don't wear red, around the fairies, because they don't like it and they'll take you." Another case, another culture, another accounts rather, you'll hear other traditions. You'll hear that you need to wear red because it reminds the fairies of fire or the fact that they can't bleed and they'll scared of it. So you will hear a lot of contradictions. But I guess the point that I would make is that, like, color of clothing is somehow involved, and I can't really provide an answer for why that would have something to do with Bigfoot. So if you can really go down the whole list. It's like a litany of things that tend to correspond to fairy folklore a little bit more than the flesh and blood Bigfoot hypothesis. But if, as I go great lengths to address in Volume 1 with Tim, I have trouble to a certain degree separating Bigfoot from fairy folklore of Northwestern Europe, or really kind of anywhere. The biggest hurdle that you have to get past is the fact that fairies are considered short and Bigfoot are considered typically gigantic. But fairies were all shapes and sizes, including things like trolls and giants. And to say nothing of the fact that they could also size shift in addition to shape shifting. So that's not really that big of a hurdle to get across.
Miners and hunters and others have reported rocks being thrown against cabin walls, beating against the sides of cabins, and that there seem to be several Bigfoot creatures, but I've never heard of any actually getting in or of humans being hurt by them. How do you account for such reports?
Well, that kind of goes back to the whole thing of, the people who had the worst encounters with Bigfoot are never going to be able to to tell us how bad it was, right?
Yeah.
You will find. So one of the compelling things about those missing 411 stories are the ways that people have taken off their clothing, right? It's really strange. They always specifically, and they'll fold it up nice and tidy, which implies something with two
agency.
hands.
Yeah.
Yeah, agency. I don't think people will cite paradoxical undressing, which is what happens when you hit a certain stage of hypothermia. You're so cold that your body thinks that it's hot and it's stripped down, or you burrow. But I don't think you'd take the time to fold your clothes. There are some fairy connections there that we can talk about too. But besides that, thinking about the people who had the worst encounters with Bigfoot, the missing 411 stuff might represent that a little bit. Also, there's a podcast by a mutual friend of Timothy's and mine called OK Talk, and Clint, the host, is talking about a mysterious death in Texas that was attributed to a mountain lion at first, but all the authorities around it have been acting very strange. They've basically been saying, oh, it's a wildcat attack. Oh, wait, no, it's not a wildcat attack, but everybody needs to be aware that there's possibly a predator on the loose. Anyway, it's just some stuff that's been happening in conjunction with one of his friends having some really strange, dare I say, squatchy behavior on his property. It's the Cougar Hollow episodes that just came out. And, it's interesting. I don't know. But you do hear these stories about people who have a problem with Bigfoot and don't survive to tell the tale. There's a story of Teddy Roosevelt, of all people, who was, I'm trying to remember if I get this right, was a gentleman by the name of Bauman, who was either with Teddy Roosevelt or who friends
Was
with
one of
him,
the
or he
Rough
heard of.
Riders.
No, I don't think it was one of the Rough Riders. It was oh yeah, here we go. So I'm gonna look it up. So everybody could have Googled this themselves, but
Yeah.
I'm Googling it now because I know the story. I just spent a minute. Bigfoot said that he was told this story by a hunter named Bauman, who claims that he saw a quote unquote bear walking on two legs that was not a bear. And he had shot the rifle and tried to scare the creature away. But anyway, this thing had been seen around their camp, and he left. And when he came back one day to camp, his body was his friend's body, his fellow camper's body, was lying against a tree with fang marks on its neck. And it had just
Kolchak the Night Stalker, calling Kolchak the Night Stalker.
Yeah, there was a Kolchak episode where he ran into a Rakshasa, which is kind of like a Hindu hairy man. Yeah, interesting. Which was a shapeshifter. Not that Rakshasas are like Indian Bigfoot, but they're a sort of devil creature that's often.
I think I remember the Rakshasa from my Dungeons and Dragons monster manual.
Yeah, Dungeons and Dragons is a lot like Harry Potter in that, like, probably a solid 75% of it is not made up. I mean, obviously they'll, add to it and elaborate and sort of gild the lily a little bit, but a lot of the names, a lot of the core concepts are plucked right from folklore.
Yeah, that's interesting. Mr. MH says there's a weird case, if my memory serves me right, of a Bigfoot carrying off a man who is a hunter and keeping him prisoner. The man observed the Bigfoot and its family, and he managed to escape. Probably a made-up story, but interesting nevertheless. Any input on that?
Yes. Actually, believe it or not, there are two stories like that.
And the first one, if I recall correctly, is of a woman in the same situation.
Well, there are some stories of women being abducted as well. But the ones that I'm thinking of in terms of hunters being abducted and sort of held for breeding purposes, male hunters is what I was thinking of. The first one is, I know the story and I cannot remember his name. His name was Albert Ostman. That's right. Albert Ostman. He was a prospector, so not quite a hunter, but a prospector. And this is probably the one that he's remembering because it's one of the more famous ones. He swore in 1957 that 33 years earlier he had been abducted by a Bigfoot. He was sleeping in his sleeping bag, and this big hairy man just picked him up and carried him away. And for 3 hours, they went over all this territory, and they ended up in this valley. And there were 4 Sasquatch that he also thought were included, rather, because the one that took him, he assumed it was mother, son, and daughter. And they actually fed him. They gave him some sweet roots to eat. And he had the sense that he was being held to court the female Bigfoot. And the way that he escaped was that he actually was putting some snuff in his mouth and sort of trying to act like it was delicious, And the Bigfoot took the snuff and threw the snuff into his mouth, and then that hurt, and so he ended up grabbing coffee off the campfire and chugging hot coffee, and in the commotion, supposedly, because it went away ran away to a stream to get some water. In the ensuing commotion, he was able to stage an escape. I think John Green said that the story seemed to check out. I don't know. It's interesting. The other one that I found really interesting, and a good deal more disturbing, was a logger in 1914 in Northern California who was recovered after disappearing, after going missing. And he claimed that he was found in a deep pit, and he claimed that he had been put in that pit by a female ape that was forcing itself upon him, and to keep him from escaping, it would lick his hands raw, and he actually ended up dying of exposure a couple of days later. So, yeah, a real charming story, that.
Yeah. Between the Texas Big Thicket, Pennsylvania, the Pacific Northwest, Boggy Creek, East Coast Bigfoot, what are the differences in the sighting reports?
So I heard an interesting theory that it didn't make it into the book, but I kind of wish that it would, because it sort of alludes to a psychosocial component. It's almost sort of a Valayan psychosocial component. So yeah, you can sort of make some generalizations. These are not as fixed as some people would have you believe. I think it was Jerry Clark who said that once you go east of the Mississippi, Bigfoot, or large hairy hominids, or hairy bipeds, as they call them sometimes, tended to descend more into the goblin universe, which is an F.W. Holiday term, I believe. But generally speaking, Pacific Northwest, human footprints, are much larger, are much more muscular, and seem to have a better disposition than southeastern Bigfoot. Of course, Bigfoot have been seen in, people will say all 49 states except Hawaii. Tim and I found a wild man account from Hawaii, and there's some giant accounts from Hawaii as well. So I'm just going to say all 50 states. So you've got your Pacific Northwest Bigfoot that tend to be better dispositioned and have human feet, or feet looking like human feet, albeit much larger. And then you have the sort of southeastern Bigfoot, which sometimes, not always, have feet that are in sort of a typical, what they call pongoid formation, which basically means, if you've ever looked at a chimp foot or a gorilla foot, the thumb is displaced. Well, sorry, one of the toes is displaced in a manner similar to a thumb. Not super consistent, though, because you'll find the human feet, human-shaped feet in the South, and you'll also find, famously the Falk monster with 4 toes, another 4-toed Bigfoot. But they all tend to be more aggressive, and if you're going to find a flat-nosed Bigfoot as opposed to a hooded-nosed Bigfoot, probably going to be in the Southeast, probably going to be more monkey-like, probably going to be shorter, probably going to be more rangy, so to speak, in terms of its build. And then Pennsylvania is just all sorts of weird. And you've got Bigfoot up and down, the East Coast that make all sorts of combinations therein. And throughout the Midwest, again, it's just everywhere has its Bigfoot. And they're all in some ways roughly the same, but there are, again, if we're talking about subspecies, I would expect these to be hard and fast rules, but they're really not.
But they're not.
Yeah, because you have some that look a lot like a human. Some people will say, oh, it was an ape that looked like a human, and some people will say it was a human that looked like an ape. So you have all these differentiations. But what I find interesting is that someone pointed this out to me, and I didn't really think about it, but he was pointing out how Bigfoot in secular areas versus Bigfoot in like evangelical, highly religious areas tend to have a different disposition. And I'm like, oh, that's a really interesting idea, which again ties into the fact that this is some sort of, this has something to do with the way that we perceive things and our expectations, because that is true. Southern Bigfoot tend to be a little bit more aggressive than a lot of the northern Bigfoot. The northern Bigfoot, just tend to be shy and retiring and walking away,
as opposed to the skunk ape and things like that.
Yeah, skunk ape, wood booger. You'll hear that term booger thrown around a lot, which I always find interesting because, booger is a direct, in terms of the development of that word, it's a direct descendant from, the word boogeyman, which is a direct descendant, which is, itself is descended from boggarts and bogles and all those sort of fairies that like to steal children. So we're still talking about these things in those terms. We just don't.
The etymology is fascinating.
Yeah, what blows my mind? Something I'm writing about right now is a quick little digression. You were talking about missing 411, and some of these missing 411 stories sound like the Wild Hunt. Sound like the stories.
And for those of our audience that aren't familiar, what's the Wild Hunt?
It's a lot of different things. If you've ever heard the song Ghost Riders in the Sky, that's pretty close. But generally speaking,
this goes back to a Celtic background, right?
Well, it goes back just to Northern European background, which probably more specifically it's most common in Germany, Belgium, Austria, that kind of area. But it's generally one of several things. It's either an army of the dead, or an army of fairies, or an army of Valkyries, or an army of malicious spirits, sometimes led, sometimes not led by a figure that is either Odin or Herne the Hunter or King Arthur or any number of different figures. But you're talking about etymology, and this is something that I found really fascinating. Is that there's the earliest account of the Wild Hunt has an individual who describes its leader, which is a big, tall giant, as Herlichin, Herlechin, and because so you get like this Herlithing, Herlichin, Helikin, you get all these different terms thrown around for the Wild Hunt, which also in turn were applied to the beings that sometimes populated the Wild Hunt. And it's kind of hard to differentiate the dead from demons in a lot of older folklore, to say nothing of the fact that sometimes the Wild Hunt was made up of demons, right? So this Helikin, Herlikin, Harlekin became Alekin.
Say that 5 times fast with marbles in your mouth.
Right. But it's where we get Harlequin from, the original. Right. The original clown, because the demons were kind of tricksters, and Dante and his Inferno included a character. So Harlequin comes from the Wild Hunt. So clowns have a demon connotation.
Oh, that's why they're so scary.
Well, and here's where my mind started to melt, is that there's also a myth of a king very much like Arthur named King Herla, who went to have a parley with the dwarves and was kind of one of the first victims of missing time. And he came out after spending just a short amount of time in the dwarf's palace, and he couldn't dismount from his horse or else he would turn into dust. And so he rides forevermore, and he rides in the British Wild Hunt. He's Herla King, right? So you got that same phraseology, but also Herla King, Earl King, the Earl König, the fairy, the Earl King, the Elf King, who sometimes abducts people as well. So that's just one of those things that's like a real twisted knot of etymology. I love word origins so much.
Oh, me too. And I recall that there are tales of the Bigfoot in the Texas Big Thicket turning into balls of light, or shape-shifting Bigfoot into large cats like panthers. Again, what does your experience inform you on in regard to that?
Well, I think it was, again, stop me if we said this, but Lauren Coleman, even himself, was pretty much, not entirely, but pretty much a flesh and blood hypothesis guy. Said that you can very easily draw a map between Bigfoot sightings and alien black cat sightings. These anomalous, or these large cats that we're not supposed to have in America.
Mm-hmm.
By which I mean, we do have puma populations in America. Supposedly, no breeding populations east of the Mississippi, although everybody east of the Mississippi knows that they're here. To the extent that, like, I keep an eye on this because I'm from North Carolina, and people in North Carolina have like hit them and like killed them, but there were still no breeding population though. Those just wandered over here, right?
Right.
The consensus among a lot of cryptozoologists is that they just sort of don't want to acknowledge that they're here because it's just more red tape to worry about.
Mm-hmm.
But we are not supposed to have panthers in the United States. You might get a melanistic, which means all black, jet black. You might get a melanistic jaguar in Texas. I mean, it's not super common to get jaguars in Texas and Arizona, but you might, and they can be melanistic, right? But as far as a melanistic puma, mountain lion, cougar, never caught or killed officially, right? So you have these things that aren't supposed to exist. There's actually an evening political commentator here in Atlanta who like saw one in his backyard a couple of years ago.
Wow.
In like suburban Atlanta. So like it's not just, he made an announcement on the radio. I should have called in or something and talked to him about it. But yeah, it's really, really, really nutty. But you can make these sort of correlations between large cats and Bigfoot to the extent that they are sometimes seen together. I think we might have mentioned the Minerva, Ohio sightings, but in the Minerva
Mm-hmm.
monster sightings in Minerva, Ohio, in I believe the 1970s it was, you had these cats, these big cats, like mountain lions with these like strange shaped heads that were sometimes seen like following and stopping with the Bigfoot as well. Now, of course, it's not shape-shifting into, but it certainly does imply a connection there. You'll also find in some medieval art wild men leading lions or something along those lines. And then you have the ball of light. So one of my favorite stories was there's a UFO flap in the Philippines, and this woman goes out and sees like this giant hairy creature sort of shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink until it turns into an orb of light and then just floats off. A bonkers story, but I love it. And so you do find these stories of Bigfoot changing into or coming out of balls of light. I don't mean like stepping out. I mean like transforming from balls of light. You do have stories of Bigfoot shape-shifting. A lot of indigenous tribes feel that way. And then did we talk about the greaser?
I don't remember.
Okay. So there's a story that I really like of these guys who are on this ATV track. Maybe somebody in the chat will say whether or not we talked about this last time. But these guys are on an ATV track in Pennsylvania. Sorry, Pennsylvania. And it was sort of a loop. And as they came around on the loop one time, they saw this big hairy creature cross. And it crossed into a part of the forest where they said, hey, if this thing continues on a straight line, I know exactly where it should be coming out. So they rushed around to that other side. Sounding familiar?
Nope.
Okay, you're nodding, so I didn't know. They rushed around to the other side of the loop, right? After seeing this Bigfoot, they rushed around to where they thought the Bigfoot would come through. And they stop. And standing there, like propped up against the tree, is like the Fonz, right? It's like this 1950s.
You mean like, hey, the Fonz?
Yeah.
Fonzie.
Yeah, it's like this 1950s greaser who's like in this. I don't think he's wearing a jacket, but he's got the hair done. He's wearing these like white boat shoes that are absolutely immaculate, even though it's muddy. And they're like, "Where do you live?" And he's like, "Oh, just over there." And they're like, "Okay, well, you walk here?" And he's like, "Yeah." So they talk for like just the smallest of small talk. I don't think they even get around to asking him about the Bigfoot. But he lit a cigarette that didn't smoke and didn't burn down, and he had this awful aftershave smell associated with him. And as they're talking to him, they both glance away, and when they look back, the guy's gone. Now, that's not there's no way to say that was shape-shifting Bigfoot, right? Nobody saw Bigfoot change into a greaser or change out of a greaser, but that's awfully suspect, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, what that means, I have no idea. But you do
That's
see these
pretty
stories.
fucking weird.
Well, I mean, let's make it even weirder. There
Okay.
was there was another story that I found of these people traveling in Italy who claimed to see this wild man. This bright light descends from the sky, and out of it steps this naked, hairy wild man that is jumping along the road. And as it jumps, it transforms into a person with long brown hair in light colored pants and a dark jacket. So we got another got another Bigfoot greaser.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't know, but here's the thing: I love these stories. You know, I love the weirder the story because, for me, the weirder the story is, the less likely I find the less likely I feel someone is messing it up. Like either they're absolutely taking the piss, or they are, or it's exactly what they saw and it's nonsensical. And I just absolutely love those stories.
Yeah, Mr. MH says it sounds like the cigarette smoking dogs at Skinwalker Ranch.
Yeah, that was a very that's a very astute observation. It's a lot like that. And there's some people who want to say um that uh Bigfoot is a skinwalker. I'm sympathetic to that, and you'll find some indigenous technology that sort of alludes to that, but I think it would be a little bit closer without invoking that specific set of beliefs, because that is a very specific set of Southwestern beliefs about skinwalkers, saying that they're some sort of black magician, right?
Right.
Yeah, because that's something that you do find consistent in a couple of different tribes. And again, in case anybody's wondering, we mentioned tribes by name in the book. I just can't I can't find them all on the PDF.
Lakota,
Yeah.
Sioux.
Oh yeah. As specific as we can get.
Yeah.
Because that's the other thing that kills me is that you read some of these books and they're like, well, the Native Americans thought Bigfoot was this, and it's like that's a lot of different beliefs.
Kind of a broad brush.
Yeah, you just can't do that, because there are some that thought it was that thought, unfortunately past tense, I guess, but some that thought Bigfoot was an animal, or solely a spirit, or an animal with spiritual abilities, or a person, or like I said, a witch of some sort. So it really is it's a complex topic to navigate.
What other cases stand out that you can share with our viewers?
Oh my. So there is one story that I found really interesting. I might just read the whole darn thing. Yeah. Because it's interesting to me. It's sort of caused a little bit of a kerfuffle. Because I found that some people in the cryptozoological community were not describing aspects of it as honestly as they could, because they were sort of glossing over the stranger aspects. This appeared in a 1929 issue in April of Maclean's magazine, and it comes from J.W. Burns, who wrote several other articles on Bigfoot. The date is actually April 1st, so that's a red flag, but J.W. Burns said some other stuff, had some other articles that are sort of accepted as Bigfoot canon, so I don't know why we should include that. Charlie Victor belonged to the Squaw Reserve near Chilliwack. In his younger days, he was known as one of the best hunters in the province and had many thrilling adventures in his time. Did he know anything about the hairy ape-like men who were supposed to inhabit the distant mountains? Charlie smiled and answered that he had a slight acquaintance with them. He had been in what he thought was one of their houses. And that is not all, said he. I met and spoke to one of the women, and I shot... But let Charlie tell the story for himself. The strange people, of whom there are but few now, rarely seen and seldom met, said the old hunter, are known by the name of Sasquatch or the hairy mountain men. I don't know if I should tell you or not about the awful experience I had with these wicked people about 15 years ago in the mountains near Hatsey. The old man rubbed his knee and said he disliked recalling that disagreeable meeting. It was a tragedy from which he had not yet fully recovered. I was hunting in the mountains near Hatsey, he resumed. I had my dog with me. I came out on a plateau where there were several big cedar trees. The dog stood before one of the trees and began to growl and bark at it. On looking up to see what excited him, I noticed a large hole in the tree 7 feet from the ground. The dog pawed and leaped upon the trunk and looked at me to raise him up, which I did, and he went into the hole. The next moment, a muffled cry came from the hole. I said to myself, the dog is tearing into a bear, and with my rifle ready, I urged the dog to drive him out. And out came something I took for a bear. I shot it, and it fell with a thud to the ground. Murder, oh my! I spoke to myself in surprise and alarm, for the thing I had shot looked to me like a white boy. He was nude. He was about 12 or 14 years of age. In his description of the boy, Charlie said that his hair was black and woolly. Wounded and bleeding, the poor fellow sprawled upon the ground, but when I drew close to examine the extent of his injury, he let out a wild yell, or rather a call, as if he were appealing for help. From across the mountain a long way off rolled a booming voice. Near and more near came the voice, and every now and again the boy would return an answer as if directing the owner of the voice. Less than a half hour, out from the depths of the forest came the strangest and wildest creature one could possibly see. I raised my rifle not to shoot, but in case I would have to defend myself. The hairy creature, for that is what it was, walked toward me without the slightest fear. The wild person was a woman. Her face was almost Negro black, and her long, straight hair fell to her waist. In height she would be about 6 feet, but her chest and shoulders were well above the average breadth. Charlie remarked that he had met several wild people in his time, but had never seen anyone half so savage in appearance as this woman. The old brave confessed he was really afraid of her. In my time, said the old man, and this is no boast, I have in more than one emergency strangled bear with my hands. But I'm sure if that wild woman laid hands on me, she'd break every bone in my body. She cast a hasty glance at the boy. Her face took on a demoniacal expression when she saw that he was bleeding. She turned upon me savagely, and in the Douglas tongue she said, "You have shot my friend." I explained in the same language, for I'm part Douglas myself, that I had mistaken the boy for a bear and that I was sorry. She did not reply, but began a sort of wild frisk or dance around the boy, chanting in a loud voice for a minute or two, and, as if in answer to her, from the distant woods came the same sort of chanting troll. In her hand she carried something like a snake, about 6 feet in length. But thinking the matter over since, I believe it was the intestine of some animal. But whatever it was, she constantly struck the ground with it. She picked up the boy with one hairy hand, with as much ease as if he had been a wax doll. At this point, Charlie began to make pictures in the sand with his maple stick, and paused or reflected so long that we thought he had come to the end of his narrative, when he suddenly looked up and said with a grin, "Perhaps I'd better tell you the rest of it, although I know you'll not believe it." There was challenge of defiance in her black eyes and dark looks, went on Charlie, as she raised and spoke to me a second time, and the dreadful words she used set me shaking. "You remember them?" I asked. "Remember them," he repeated. "They still ring round my old ears like the echo of a thunderstorm." She pointed the snake-like thing at me and said, "Siwash, you'll never kill another bear." The old hunter's eyes moistened when he admitted that he had not shot a bear or anything else since that fatal day. Her words, expression, and the savage avenging glint in her dark, fiery eyes filled me with fear, confessed the Indian, and I felt so exhausted from her unwavering gaze that I was no longer able to keep her covered with my rifle. I let it drop. Charlie has since been paralyzed for the last 8 years, and he is inclined to think that the words of the wild woman had something to do with it. The old man told how his brave dog, that never turned away from any bear nor cougar, lay whimpering and shivering at his feet while the Sasquatch woman was speaking. Just, said Charlie, as if he understood the meaning of her words. The old man said that she spoke the words Yahoo, Yahoo frequently in a loud voice, always received a similar reply from the mountain. He did not think the boy belonged to the Sasquatch people because he was white and she called him her friend, reasoned Charlie. They must have stolen him or run across him in some other way, he added. Indians, said Charlie, have always known that wild men lived in the distant mountains, within 60 and 100 miles east of Vancouver. And of course they may live in other places throughout the province, but I have never heard of it. It is my own opinion, since I met that wild woman 15 years ago, that because she spoke the Douglas tongue, these creatures must be related to the Indian. So yeah, a lot to unpack there. That's a weird Bigfoot story, right?
That is weird.
And some there are some prominent cryptozoologists who said that because there's this curse, right? And they were like, there's no Bigfoot curse because he said it was 15 years ago, but he was only paralyzed for 8. And I'm like, well, but the curse is that he won't shoot a bear, and that took immediate effect,
Right.
And somebody else said that he had shot a white Sasquatch. Well, the story is explicitly clear that it was a white kid. It wasn't a white Sasquatch. And it's I think it's a deliberate attempt to make that story into something it's not. Which, I mean, what that story is that's like a wild man story. That's like a witch story, right? You've got this Bigfoot, running around and smacking the ground with a sacrificed intestine or something and cursing
like
him.
a forest magic user.
Yeah, and and the Bigfoot curse is something that happens a lot, and every time it happens, there's always a deliberate attempt by the cryptozoological establishment to downplay it. There's another story with a Bigfoot curse called the Ruby Creek incident, which is a 1941 sighting. The Ruby Creek incident.
Okay.
It's a 1941 sighting by the Chapman family, and a boy comes in and tells his mother that a cow was coming out of the woods, and it wasn't a cow. The mom saw that it was like a Bigfoot, so she grabs a blanket and she is hiding her children behind the blanket, and they walk to the town. And Bigfoot supposedly had this curse, and this was all revealed in an interview with Ivan T. Sanderson. And he's like, well, the children died within 3 years of that sighting. 2 of the boys by drowning, and one of the boys on a sickbed. And after Sanderson interviewed the parents, they had their boat capsize. And you'll find the cryptozoologists be like, well, there's no curse. Well, okay, look, I would say 3 years for children to die in the 40s is pretty close to a curse. Well, the interview with Sanderson was 18 years later. That's a long time afterwards. I'm like, yes, but if you look at things like the fairy folk, sometimes speaking of them or speaking ill of them was enough to get cursed or enough to get punished. So I think that it's hard to say that there is no Bigfoot curse. There's another example of as my friend Miguel Romero points out, there's even if there's not a curse, if there is a psychosocial belief that there's a curse, then there's a curse. You know what I mean? Because it still influences people. It's still people. Again, if placebo is a thing, then nocebo is a thing, right? You can sort of will your body into failing. So if you think there's a curse, there's a power of suggestion, but also, it keeps people from taking the shot. Like, you'll read some indigenous testimony where they're like, well, I had this thing in my sights and I was going to shoot it, but then I remembered all my tribe's testimony that if I kill it or hurt it or harm it, then I will, I'll be ruined for the rest of my days. So, I think there definitively is a curse. Whether or not it has some objective power is up for debate. But I mean, this stuff in general, and by I mean the paranormal, well, it's not nice. You know what I mean? There's an aspect of this that is just pervaded by negativity, death. It attracts marginal people, Sometimes it attracts disreputable people.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it attracts weirdos. And I say this like as being involved in the field myself, okay?
Yeah.
But like, I mean, ufology looks like the WWE, right? I mean, or the WWF, the World Wrestling Federation, right? In a lot of ways, there's infighting, and this is all George Hansen stuff. But I think you got to be careful when you look into this stuff that you don't look too hard, because it looks back. It really does.
Yeah. Yeah. Josh, how would Terrence McKenna regard the ethnobotanical aspects of paranormal Bigfoot?
Well, people ask me if I've ever seen anything resembling a giant ape man, and I said, heavens no, I'm very glad I haven't. I don't know what I'd do with myself. I'd much prefer the self-transforming, dribbling machine elves. But, you never know. You just sort of have to take what you can get when you're in these sort of states.
Why is Gigantopithecus a bad analog for Bigfoot?
That's a great question. Because it doesn't look like fucking Bigfoot.
Yeah.
I mean, so I get the well, okay, so let me back this up. I kind of have a little bit of a problem with the scientific method when it comes to some of these reconstructions of things like Gigantopithecus, because I think we know Gigantopithecus from a tooth, and we're extrapolating
or a jawbone.
Yeah, or it's like a tooth or a jawbone or both. Anyway, it's very, very fragmentary. Which, I mean, obviously it was something. I'm not, sitting here saying that, the devil put the bones in the earth, or that it's a cow, or that it's a cow jawbone or anything. But I feel like it's a bit of a stretch to act like we have an idea of what it looked like, extrapolating it out from a tooth. You can say, well, this looks a lot like an animal's tooth that we know what it looks like, but to mock up an entire body seems a bridge too far. But if you look at a lot of these recreations, they just don't look like what people are seeing when they describe Bigfoot. What we're seeing with Gigantopithecus is an animal so big, I believe 9 feet or something, if memory serves. An animal so big that it was quite sedentary, it seems like. And it seems to be oriented much more like a great ape than it does what we see with Bigfoot. And with these stories of Bigfoot, obviously there's an ape-like character to it, but I would have to say that a lot of the stories are they tip the needle from ape-like human into human-like ape pretty definitively. By which I mean, people will say that it appears human. Sometimes that's the reason that they can't take the shot, is because it feels like they're killing a person. But, just in terms of physiology, I mean, these don't appear to be things that can awkwardly shift to an upright gait if they have to. These appear to be things that are completely designed for bipedal locomotion, and that just isn't what Gigantopithecus seems to be. Now, whether in the there's this thing that you always, when you're reading stories as a kid about alligators in the sewers, or about mole people or whatever, you always think oh, well, they evolved to be weird. So you're when you're a kid, you're oh, those 3 generations, right? And now they're full-fledged monster people, right? And that's not the way evolution works at all.
No.
So I don't know if the time scale for Gigantopithecus to have crossed the Bering Land Bridge, if there was a Bering Land Bridge from whence mankind came, that out of Africa idea is a little bit challenged by some people. But
I've even heard of an out of Australia idea.
Yeah, I'm kind of a fan of that. Because you look at it, it's the likely the oldest, at least the oldest existing civilization in the world, if not one of the oldest, the oldest civilization to ever exist. So, yeah, I'm really interested in that. Australia and island Southeast Asia as being an origin point, but But yeah, so I don't know if the intervening time between when it would have crossed over might have led to evolutionary adaptations. I don't think so. Honestly, I think that if there is a flesh and blood aspect to Bigfoot, we're looking at something that is much more closely related to human beings. And, they just found this, they're calling it Dragon Man or whatever in China. I don't know if you saw that, but
No.
they found another jawbone or something, and they've done some recreations of it. But the fact of the matter is,
yet another missing link.
Yeah, part of the family tree. Yeah. And I know Dragon Man sounds a lot. It sounds like it'll be a lot cooler, right?
When they find it, they get to name it whatever they want.
Yeah,
right?
I guess so. But as far as like something human-like that's tall, we really don't have it in the fossil record, unless you're looking at some of the mound builders. Not that I necessarily think that the mound builders were gigantic tall people, but those, I don't know if we talked about this, but like those rumors are persistent.
There were giants in the earth those days.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's I think they're a lot more credible than people want to say that they are. Because they were just finding them everywhere, and I'm sure some of them were overblown or were yellow journalism. But there's some well documented. Even one of the original chroniclers, I can't remember his name, saved my life. But the original guy that the United States government hired to sort of document the mounds before they disappeared, said that some of these are fake, but some of them are genuine. He was genuinely puzzled by some of the remains and how large they were. And you hear stories about the Susquehannock Indians in Pennsylvania being taller than people. Apparently that wasn't super tall. Apparently it was just taller than the average European, which was like 5'5" or something, but still.
It's like basketball player tall.
Yeah. Which is still, I think remarkable in and of itself. But I've been fascinated by the mounds lately, in case you can't tell. But I think that'll be the closest thing that we could say resembles a Bigfoot skeleton or some of those mound skeletons. And, the mounds are weird. They have a lot of window area stuff associated with them. And
mounds, man, they're just weird. They're freaky, I don't know. Fantastic.
You know how you can tell, you can tell if it's just like a hill versus a mound?
No.
It's a really easy way to tell. If you dig into it, and it has nuts, it's a hill, because mounds don't.
Very good. Very good.
Yeah.
Mounds don't. That's right. Are researchers too rigid in the scientific method, and should there be a wider, more loosely affiliated method to the research of this phenomenon?
Yes. I think that there's this clamoring in ufology and in Bigfoot study to be scientific, and by that they mean like materialist scientists, right? Scientific,
right?
And I think that there are a lot of things pushing us beyond that direction. And if you quantum physics doing it, fine, whatever. I tend to look to the work of people. Again, I'm pretty sure I did mention this last time, like Dean Radin and Daryl Bim and all these people who are doing these laboratory psi experiments at levels that, if it were anything else, would be considered like quote unquote proof of psi phenomena. I think it was one of those SRI guys.
Remote viewing.
Yeah, it was either Hal. I don't think it was Hal Puthoff, but I think it was
Ingo Swann.
I think it might have been Ingo Swann, who said that we have more evidence for the existence of psi than we do for the efficacy of aspirin.
Oh wow!
So anyway, so we're still trying to play that materialist game, right? And the analogy that I use is that the cryptozoologists are kind of disenchanters in that Protestant sense, right? So you've got like the high church. It was the mystical church, and the Protestants came along and they're like, okay, well, we're going to make this sort of grounded, and we're going to take all the mysticism out of it. And let's, you can make the same comparisons between cryptozoology and the paranormal. It's like the cryptozoologists are the ones who are kind of taking all the mystery out of it. And I think it's fine to demystify, but I just think that I don't think that's the path that we're going to get. And I think that okay, fine, then we'll eventually call it science, sure, but like right now, it's still relegated to the realm of mysticism. And I'm also reminded of what synchronistic Christopher Knowles says. He says, "Don't mix your science with mysticism and your mysticism with science, because you just get bad science and bad mysticism." I think that. Look, if everything else that I'm saying is complete bullshit, at the very least, we don't have a fucking body yet. So let's try something different,
Right.
There's it's kind of funny. There's a rebuttal being published in the Society for Scientific Exploration journal, in which an excerpt of my first chapter from Volume 1 appeared. Society for Scientific Exploration, exploration,
yeah, that sounds more likely.
Not explanation. Anyway, it's a rebuttal being issued by a gentleman who is saying, don't cross the streams, don't mix Bigfoot and poltergeist, and I'm like, okay,
keep your UFOs out of my Bigfoot. Keep your Bigfoot out of my UFOs.
Yeah, and like, number one, that I don't think that is an intellectually honest way of looking at it, because some of the similarities that you see are just uncanny, right? Like the horse braiding thing. I mean,
WTF?
Yeah. But again, like what I come down on is like, okay, so we can keep on beating our head against the wall looking for monkeys in the woods for another 70 years. Sure. Okay. I mean, I'm sure that the folks who are still into UFO disclosure will say that's a great idea.
Yeah.
And it's not even that I'm cynical. Like I think that I would love for there to be proof of Bigfoot, and I would, in some ways, I would love for it to be a big monkey. It'll be vindicating, and it would be really cool. But
it would put you out of business.
Yeah, well, that's the thing that my good friend Tim Banal always says, is that, like, for all these people, for all these little UFO Twitterites clamoring for disclosure, like, they realize that they're like setting themselves up to be bored, right? Like, the moment UFOs come out as revealed as a truth, they're not going to be fucking asking, UFO Spaceman 85 on Twitter for his opinion. They're going to be asking like Michio Kaku and Neil deGrasse Tyson, who are going to pivot really quickly and profit really quickly. So, like, why are you clamoring to put yourself out of business? But, but I think that the Bigfoot thing with the along with the UFO thing is like it's kind of a personal experience, and I know it sounds sort of wishy-washy and touchy-feely and airy-fairy, but what I mean by that is, like, I don't think I would put a bet. I would literally bet your life, if I were you, on not knowing, quote unquote, the 100% truth about Bigfoot or UFOs or ghosts, like any of those things being accepted in your lifetime. I think there's a slim chance of that. So what you've got to turn to is this idea of, let's use the UFO term, disclosure. That's not going to come from a government. That's going to come from yourself. Like, you're the one who has to be convinced that these things are real.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, you're the only one who matters whether or not it's real. And, like, look, if you don't think these things are real, there are plenty of opportunities for you to figure it out. Like, the Venn diagram of people who don't believe in ghosts and the people who have actually spent the night in, like, several haunted houses, it's like two circles, right? I mean, it's, or it's, or you have people who just go so far out of their way to dismiss the experience that they're just laughable. There's a professional skeptic. I can't remember who he is. I can't remember if it's Shermer or Radford, or it wasn't Colavito, but one of those guys was like getting married, and like on their wedding day, their grandfather's radio that hadn't worked for like 20 years, their antique radio, all of a sudden started playing their grandfather's favorite song.
That was Shermer.
Oh, Shermer, yeah.
Yeah.
And like to be fair, he was, he found it odd, but like if that's not the moment where you can't get the toothpaste back in the tube, you're a lost cause. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because you do have that's a that's a lot of specific random things coming together to make that happen. So, yeah, I mean, you're the one who needs to be convinced. You can find ways to convince yourself. I think somebody in the chat said that if you don't think that there's Bigfoot, I invite you to spend time in a heavily trafficked Bigfoot area. I don't know. I talked to again Mike Clellan again. He's spent a lot of time in the woods, and I don't think he's ever had a Bigfoot experience. He's had other strange experiences, but he's never had a Bigfoot experience. So, like, I don't know. I think there's some people who are going to be more receptive to the stuff and more open to the stuff than others. But at the same time, you can Goldilocks your way towards the truth for sure.
That's an interesting way of putting it. There have been three-toed tracks that resemble bird tracks and all different kinds reported, as well as bat squatch, goat men, sheep squatch. What do you think is the explanation for all these different sightings? And Josh, I wanted to sort of remind you that we're in rapid fire mode at this point.
Yeah, no. I mean, here's the thing. Like when we got a pull quote or a blurb rather from Patrick Harper for the first book, and he was like, "Okay, what's your thesis?" And I said, Bigfoot's weird. Like that's as far as I think we can go. And Tim would say the same thing. Like I don't think we're any really close to any answers than we were. Wildman archetype, yeah, but like I think that there are, John Mack, late UFO researcher, used to like to talk about this idea of the reified metaphor, the idea that somehow metaphors can sort of almost be brought into our reality. And that's sort of the headspace that I'm in right now, is that we're kind of constantly blending the lines between reality and fiction with our folklore. And I think that's what we're seeing, because all the things that you'll find do have some sort of overlap in folklore, and they overlap with our expectations. And you'll have things in popular culture seep into people's ideas of what should happen with these phenomena. I mean, I just heard the other day that the trope of a UFO stopping a car first appeared in fiction. I'm not sure about where that was, but like, if that's true, that's interesting, but it also kind of doesn't surprise me, because I think we are co-creating, as my friend Greg Bishop would say, we're co-creating along with this phenomena as we go along. I really do think that's a big part of it. So our expectations are influencing what we're seeing, and we're getting into this feedback loop.
Tell us about missing time in Bigfoot Encounters and what that may indicate, how traditional cryptozoology is a mechanism for disenchantment.
Yeah, well, I think that, it's interesting, the missing time thing, if you really look at it, it implies some sort of passage to the other world. I mentioned the King Hurla thing earlier, and travels to fairyland and whatnot. But there are stories of missing time in Bigfoot, or time, kind of slowing down or doing these different things. An example that I think we might have mentioned last time was the host of Sasquatch Chronicles, who thought he was at the site where he and his brother had a Sasquatch sighting. They thought they were up there for like 40 minutes max, I think, and they came down 3 or 4 hours later from the mountain. Time does not speed up when you're terrified for your life. It slows down. Anybody who's been in a car accident knows that. There was another case of a hunter who was seeing a Bigfoot, and it actually ended up coming up to him and touching his hand, or touching his leg rather. And he, for whatever reason, it took him like 2 hours to get like a quarter of a mile or something, some number like that. It took him like 2 hours to get a quarter of a mile out back to his car after it touched his leg in a tree stand. So again, I don't know what mechanism causes a monkey to do that, but I know that is something that appears in UFO stories and fairy folklore, and in some ways, in some form or fashion, some ghost stories as well.
Tell us, with all the high strangeness involved, how do you separate the real sightings from the hoaxes? What reports that are out there that you think dilute the body of reports or are altogether false? And how do the hoaxings stimulate the actual phenomena?
Well, there's certain people that I avoid their work and avoid their research. This is also the main reason why I just cite the shit out of everything in terms of my books. Because at the end of the day, I want to go back and be like, hey, look, I'm just telling you what I read, and this is where it came from. You can see that chain of custody. I'm not the person saying this is real or not. I don't know. I think I do have a little bit of what, anthropologist Jack Hunter calls a boggle threshold, right? Like there's a certain threshold that you meet and it's like, okay, I'm out, So when you have somebody talking about migrating, Bigfoot having migrated from another star system and they're living in the trees and he's helped migrate 50,000 of them. And like their leader is named Zorth, which is it's pretty close to an actual, I might have some of those details wrong, but it's pretty close. There's somebody who says that. Like that's where I kind of check out. Now, if I have somebody say that a creature told them this telepathically, I guess my real threshold, this is great, this is perfect actually. My threshold is when people have really elaborate, clean explanations for what they're seeing. So when there's this elaborate like Star Wars mythology for stuff, that's when I check out. Or when they say this is X is Y, Y is Z, that's when I check out too. I'm gonna talk about Mike Clellan again, but like he is someone who has had some experiences with something. I'll go ahead and say not human, even though we could be playing a role, but like something other, right? Mm-hmm. And even Mike in his book says, it seems to me as if, he'll say, perhaps this. He's very clear about saying, this is sort of what I think, but I don't have any answers. And when people have answers, when people have these elaborate mythologies that they've spun up, when they say, oh, no, the Greys don't come from Zeta Reticuli, they come from Betelgeuse. That's when I'm like, that's when I sort of back away a little bit. That's when I'm like, okay, I don't trust this source as much. Now, if someone says, again, that they were told this or that they think this, that's a different story. But when they're so sure of themselves, that's when I'm like, I don't know about
that. The plaster cast of Bigfoot tracks with the dermal ridges and the mid-tarsal break and so on means that something real is happening. The Bigfoot research of the 21st century seems to be much different than that of the 20th, yet we seem to be no closer to any answers.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good way to put it. I think we might have mentioned this last time, but I think that psi research is really that gateway to sort of reconciling a lot of these things. Because I've seen people who say ghosts don't leave footprints, ghosts don't shed blood. And I'm like, well, except if you would actually take the time to read the parapsychological literature, that they do some of these things. You have all sorts of residue, ectoplasm. One of the most common means of capturing a ghost when ghost hunting was to spread talcum powder on the floor and wait for footprints to come through or to collect evidence that way. So we have something that's intangible acting upon the tangible, meeting in this in-between space. And I think that's an important way to think about these things and sort of reconcile those two things. But yeah, those footprints, man, I mean, that's, the title of the book, Where the Footprints End.
Yep. Many sightings and tracks are found near or in cemeteries. How is Bigfoot connected with the realm of the dead, and how does it manifest in Bigfoot lore?
Well, we're still rapid fire, right? Yeah, I'm my current book that I'm working on is a gigantic one, and part of the reason is because it's about all these things and the dead, and we sort of covered a lot of that ground with Bigfoot in this book, but there's some other things to consider. We already mentioned the burials and the mounds that look like giant Bigfoot. I still think that it's really interesting to think of Nessie as a plesiosaur ghost and Bigfoot as a Neanderthal ghost or something. But what you really do see is a lot of traditions describing Bigfoot-like creatures in a lot of newspaper articles of yesteryear as a hairy ghost. You have these sort of disembodied hands, and it sort of ties into that poltergeist idea that we were talking about last time, about how, a lot of the things that you associate with Bigfoot, you would not be out of place in a poltergeist infestation, and people even manifest big hairy creatures in seances. I had mentioned the wild hunt, but there is, sometimes variations on the green. Well, Hearn can be seen as related to the Green Man, and the Green Man is clearly related to Bigfoot. I have heard of different accounts of Bigfoot being seen around not only modern cemeteries, but also the burial mounds. And I'm talking to someone soon who actually saw Bigfoot at a dolmen in Ireland, of all places, which, Irish Bigfoot reports, pretty few. But there are some, and the fact that Ireland would not be capable of sustaining a bunch of hairy hominids being hidden is like, okay, well, we're doing something else here.
I seem to remember something about that from one of your previous books, the Dolmens in Ireland.
Yeah,
the Dolmens in Ireland.
The Dolmens in Ireland. No, I'm fascinated by the Irish monuments because, like, the sheer density of them, I think we can't even fathom. Just ring forts in Ireland. So just the fairy forts, not the standing stones, not the stone circles, not the dolmens, not just the ring forts in Ireland are estimated at 60,000, and this is an island.
Wow.
This is an island the size of Indiana, right?
Wow.
By comparison, I think that there are some more liberal estimates of burial mounds in the U.S. that say it was 1 million, but that's a lot. I mean, when you look at the size, size comparison, it's actually a lot less dense than 60,000 in Ireland. So I find it absolutely fascinating. Yeah.
Okay, 2 more, and then we're gonna do our giveaway because we're over time. I understand that there are Men in Black analogs in the Bigfoot phenomenon. How are they different from the UFO Men in Black?
Oh, man. So there are, across like several decades, these stories started to come out. I think the person who really sort of blew the lid off them was Wes Germer at Sasquatch Chronicles. But these 2 individuals who show up, much like the Men in Black show up. And of course, the Men in Black rock up in their fedoras and their black suits and, their 1950s Cadillacs and sort of intimidate UFO witnesses into saying that they didn't see a UFO. They saw a weather balloon or whatever. And that's sort of the same modus operandi that these characters exhibit. They'll show up and say that, you saw a bear or something. But their appearance and everything is much different. It's one of them is dressed up like a G-man, yeah, but the other one is like a big, tall guy with a big bushy beard. He looks like a biker dude, and he's wearing sometimes I think a red flannel shirt. Sometimes going by the name of Bear, actually. And they'll do things like they'll show up. Like there's one case that Tim describes in the book where a guy has been harassed by these people. He's a police officer, and he's about to shoot a Bigfoot, and the Bigfoot runs away, and he turns around, and the taller of the 2 guys, the guy named Bear, says, "You couldn't do it, could you? Couldn't pull the trigger. Good man." Just like, what? The fact that they seem to have that very Men in Black sort of quality of showing up at the right places. And, the way that this guy is described as being big and burly and kind of hairy and named Bear, it kind of almost makes you wonder if Bigfoot in some sense, if he isn't that sort of Bigfoot energy, or whatever's behind the Bigfoot phenomena. Yeah.
It reminds me a lot of what we were talking about last week with the Mount St. Helens, search for the injured Bigfoot and working with the government, and then the staircases in the woods, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's this sort of thing where I have a hard time saying that even with something like the staircases in the woods, like I think that this phenomena is so adaptable that I think that a lot of times you're going to see stuff from pop culture bleeding over because that's just the way it works.
Was one of the titles that you kicked around freaky?
You know what? It was like a bolt out of the blue with Where the Footprints In. I can't remember.
It's a great title.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. It was, I think, like I said, I think there was a little Shel Silverstein in there too.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
and my final question is, what about the lady in white reports that go along with Bigfoot sightings?
So you literally saved the richest question and the most lengthy question and the one that's Tim's specialty for very last. So
Sorry.
Tim said a while back to me, hey, have you ever noticed that people who have Bigfoot sightings also see these women in white? I'm like, no, Tim, I think you're barking up the wrong tree. And he's like, no, they do. And I was like, okay, yeah, sure, whatever. And I'll be damned, he started finding them. And sometimes they were these women who were acting really strange. And he's just found, it's just the gift that keeps on giving, because there is an association of some of these wild men with these ladies in white. If you just take a look at sort of any of the Beauty and the Beast imagery or any of the King Kong imagery, you'll see that sort of thing playing out as well. In his specific examples from folklore were, he has some accounts of people like having Bigfoot on their property and also seeing this really strange, almost demonic acting lady in white. But his example, from folklore, one of them is Frau Perkta, who is this Teutonic moon goddess who is either a crone or a beautiful lady, but is always in white. And the ones that the beings that she actually leads the wild hunt as well in some of her incarnations as a Bundia or Frau Hala or any other things. But her retinue that she keeps with her are either the souls of dead children in the form of will-o'-the-wisp lights. So there you have your light connection, or the Perkton, which are a bunch of big hairy wild men. So there you have it right there. It's a crazy connection that I did not think exists, but Tim turned it into the best chapter in the book for sure.
Very cool. Before we get to our giveaway, I want to ask you where we can find where the footprints end, and where we can find more of your stuff online.
Well, you can find me at Joshua Cutchin, JoshuaCutchin.com. And there are links to all my books there and all my interviews. And Where the Footprints End, you can find at Amazon. It's published. We self-publish through Amazon. So that's kind of your only place, unless you go to a brick and mortar store and request it to be ordered, which is A-okay by me, in fact, preferred, because I do love myself a good bookstore. I will say, before we do the giveaway, that I have not had a chance to get last week's book out yet. So, Spider-Man, forgive me.
Canadian Spider-Man is very forgiving. Okay, so here's how the giveaway works for those in the chat. Just put a number between 1 and 5 in the chat, and Josh is going to pick a number, and the person that's closest without going over Price is Right rules wins volume 2 of Where the Footprints End.
Between 1 and 5, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Phantom Boomer 3, Ivan Ivanovich 2. Get those numbers in, folks. We're already over time. 30 seconds. Pick a number. Put it in the chat. 20 seconds. 10 seconds. Don McDouglas has 4. Any other takers? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Darius Munchausen has 8, and we're going to close it there. 13. I guess some people just don't want the book. Okay. Josh, what was your number?
1.
1. All right. So the closest is Ivan Ivanovich. Congratulations. And I will send his shipping address to you. And congratulations, Ivan. And Josh, I do want to thank you for spending so much time with us on Into the Fringe. It was a real treat having you on, and I hope that you'll return and talk with us again soon.
Absolutely pleasure. Absolutely pleasure.
You mentioned that you have a new project that you're working on.
Yes, it'll. Well, I've got a couple things going on. Yeah, I've got a book that I'm currently working on that's probably going to have to be split into 2 volumes again, which I didn't want to, but it's okay, we will. And I also have a book of essays that I edited and contributed to about fairy films, so fairy folklore and films. So that should be coming out real soon. Waiting on the publisher a little bit, but yeah.
Cool. Definitely be in touch.
Absolutely.
When you're ready to promote that.
Yes.
And we will welcome you back to Into the Fringe. And until then, it's Cardinal Sin